Look at the Middle East today. Red alerts, missiles flying, pure chaos between Iran and Israel. Our little penguin friend here is terrified. It seems like these two nations have been mortal enemies since the dawn of time. Right, well, what if I told you that just a few decades ago, they were actually the best of friends? Rewind. Welcome to the 1960s. Instead of trading ballistic missiles, Israeli and Iranian leaders were clinking glasses and making massive secret deals. It sounds like absolute fiction today, but this bromance was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War era. So, how did the ultimate alliance turn into the ultimate rivalry? To understand this, we have to travel back to the birth of Israel. The year is 1948. The State of Israel is established, but it immediately faces a monumental problem: extreme geographical isolation, surrounded entirely by hostile Arab nations who fiercely opposed its existence. The newly formed country was practically a tiny island in an angry sea. Enter David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister. He knew that to survive this hostile neighborhood, Israel needed to think entirely outside the box. He looked past the immediate borders and developed a genius geopolitical strategy known as the doctrine of the periphery. The logic was incredibly simple: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. If the inner ring of neighbors hated them, they needed the outer ring. Ben-Gurion sought alliances with non-Arab, Muslim-majority nations on the edge of the Middle East. And who was the biggest, most powerful candidate? Iran. At the time, Iran was ruled by the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was ambitious, Western-leaning, and had a very specific set of problems. The Shah also felt threatened by the rising wave of Arab nationalism spreading across the region, particularly from Egypt and Iraq. Suddenly, Israel and Iran realized they shared the exact same rivals. A quiet, pragmatic, and highly secret friendship began to blossom in the shadows. But here is the catch. Iran was a Muslim-majority country. Openly befriending Israel would cause an absolute diplomatic uproar in the Islamic world. So, the Shah had to play a delicate game of geopolitical hide-and-seek. He kept the entire alliance strictly under the radar. It was basically like having a best friend that you were completely terrified to introduce to your strict parents. In 1950, Iran quietly granted Israel, de facto, recognition. Israel even opened an unofficial embassy right in the heart of Tehran. But what exactly did they offer each other to make this risk worthwhile? Well, Israel was a new nation, but highly advanced in agriculture. Israeli experts traveled to Iran to help modernize their farming techniques, teaching them how to literally make the arid desert bloom. They provided advanced drip irrigation technology, medical training, and even sent emergency rescue teams to help rebuild Iranian cities after devastating earthquakes. And what did Israel get in return? The one critical resource they desperately needed to survive as a modern nation: black gold. Due to a strict Arab embargo, Israel was completely cut off from all regional energy supplies. They were practically running on fumes. Enter Iran. Sitting on some of the largest oil reserves on the planet, the Shah stepped up to become Israel's primary energy supplier. But trading massive amounts of oil wasn't easy in a hostile neighborhood. The standard shipping route meant crossing the Suez Canal. And that canal was controlled by Egypt, Israel's fierce enemy. Iranian ships simply couldn't sail through without causing a major international incident. To bypass this, they established highly secretive supply chains. Believe it or not, El Al, the Israeli airline, started direct commercial flights to Tehran. Israeli businessmen, agricultural engineers, and diplomats traveled back and forth constantly. Tehran essentially became a bustling, cosmopolitan second home for thousands of Israelis. This covert trade was so wildly successful that the two nations decided to build a massive, multi-million-dollar infrastructure project that would change the Middle East forever. Known as the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline, it was a 254-kilometer steel artery built straight across the Israeli desert. Iranian oil tankers would quietly dock at the Red Sea port of Eilat and pump their cargo directly through Israel to the Mediterranean coast. From there, the oil was shipped to Europe. Israel got a reliable energy supply and transit fees, while Iran completely bypassed the Egyptian blockade. A perfect win-win. But oil and agriculture were just the surface of this relationship. Down in the shadows, things were getting much more intense. The intelligence agencies of both nations, Israel's Mossad and Iran's SAVAK, forged a deep, symbiotic relationship. Mossad agents regularly traveled to Tehran to train SAVAK officers in counterintelligence, surveillance, and advanced tactical operations. They also shared top-secret intelligence about the common enemies, particularly their mutual neighbor, the heavily armed nation of Iraq. They basically had a shared neighborhood watch program, except instead of reporting loud music, they were tracking Soviet-backed troop movements. By the 1970s, this secret alliance reached its absolute peak. Iran was incredibly wealthy from an oil boom, and the Shah wanted a massive military upgrade. Israel, needing cash to fund its own rapidly growing defense industry, was more than happy to sell advanced military hardware to Tehran. This led to the most astonishing collaboration of all, a highly classified joint military initiative codenamed Project Flower. In 1977, Israel and Iran agreed to jointly develop advanced, nuclear-capable surface-to-surface ballistic missiles. Iran provided over $1 billion in funding and vast desert test sites, while Israel provided the cutting-edge aerospace technology. At this point, there were so many Israeli military experts and their families living in Tehran that they even had their own Hebrew schools. To both sides, it felt like a golden age of security that would last forever. But a massive earthquake was brewing right beneath their feet. That earthquake wasn't tectonic, it was entirely political. By late 1978, millions of everyday Iranians were absolutely furious with the Shah's ruling methods. While he was spending billions of dollars on advanced military gear and throwing lavish royal parties, rural communities felt completely alienated and left behind in poverty. To make matters worse, his secret police, SAVAK, brutally suppressed any opposition. This didn't create obedience, it only poured gasoline onto a growing fire of resentment. Soon, massive protests erupted. Millions of people flooded the streets of Tehran, forming an unstoppable wave of geometric crowds demanding an immediate end to the monarchy. The situation rapidly spiraled completely out of control. Despite having one of the most powerful and well-funded armies in the world, the Shah couldn't stop a popular revolution. In January 1979, realizing it was over, the Shah packed up his crown jewels, boarded an airplane, and fled Iran forever. The 2.500-year-old Persian monarchy was dead. Just 2 weeks later, an exiled cleric named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Tehran, greeted by millions of cheering supporters. A massive power vacuum was filled. Khomeini immediately swept away the old system and transformed Iran into a strict Islamic republic. And with this new government came a radically different foreign policy. He viewed the geopolitical world through a strictly religious and anti-imperialist lens. The United States was immediately labeled the Great Satan, the ultimate symbol of Western corruption. And Israel, the nation that had been secretly arming, funding, and supporting the Shah's regime for decades, was fiercely declared the Little Satan. Overnight, the decades of secret friendships, the joint ballistic missile projects, and the highly lucrative oil deals were completely shredded and thrown into the fire. But there was a massive, immediate, and terrifying problem. What about the thousands of Israeli citizens, engineers, and diplomats who were still living and working in Tehran? As heavily armed revolutionary mobs began taking over the city blocks, the unofficial Israeli embassy was completely surrounded by protesters demanding blood. In a terrifying, nail-biting covert operation, the remaining Israelis had to be quickly and secretly evacuated on some of the very last commercial flights out of the country. They barely managed to escape just days before the new regime completely severed all ties. The Golden Age was dead, and a bitter, bloody Cold War had officially begun. The Iron Curtain had fallen. The public rhetoric in Tehran shifted overnight, transforming Israel from a vital strategic partner into the ultimate ideological enemy. Streets that once safely hosted Israeli diplomats were now filled with massive murals and state-sponsored propaganda calling for the absolute destruction of the Zionist state. It seemed like the book on their relationship was permanently closed. But geopolitics is rarely that simple, and history loves a bizarre plot twist. Just 1 year later, in 1980, Iran's massive neighbor, Iraq, ruled by Saddam Hussein, sensed absolute weakness and launched a devastating, full-scale invasion. The Iran-Iraq war was incredibly brutal. Suddenly, Iran's military, which was entirely built on American and Israeli hardware, desperately needed spare parts to survive. Without these parts, their fighter jets and tanks would become useless metal husks. But absolutely nobody wanted to sell weapons to the radical new Islamic Republic. Well, almost nobody. Deep in the shadows, Israeli military strategists looked at the map and realized something completely insane: they needed to help Iran. Israel quietly concluded that a victorious, highly armed Iraq under Saddam was a much bigger immediate threat. So, they secretly began shipping weapons back to Tehran. Throughout the 1980s, Israel covertly supplied hundreds of millions of dollars in arms to Iran, strictly to ensure that neither Iran nor Iraq could actually win. Our little penguin is confused again. Yes, while publicly screaming for each other's absolute destruction, they were secretly trading anti-tank missiles in the dark. However, this cynical cooperation was strictly temporary. The real death blow to their relationship happened on an entirely different battlefield, Lebanon. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to secure its northern border. Iran saw a perfect, golden opportunity to strike at the Little Satan without risking a direct war. Iran immediately dispatched its elite Revolutionary Guards to Lebanon. They began funding, training, and arming a radical new Shiite militia group that you might recognize. They called it Hezbollah. This was a massive turning point in history. Iran realized it didn't need to fight Israel directly if it could use proxy armies. The era of quiet cooperation was officially buried forever. Welcome to the Shadow War, a deadly geopolitical chess match played across the entire Middle East. For decades, the two nations never fought a conventional war. Instead, they fought strictly in the shadows, using spies, cyber attacks, and proxy militias. The stakes of this shadow war skyrocketed in the early 2000s when the world realized Iran was aggressively developing a massive nuclear program. For Israeli leaders, an Iranian nuclear bomb was an absolute existential threat. It was a firm red line that could never be crossed under any circumstances. So, how do you completely destroy a heavily fortified, underground nuclear facility without officially starting World War III? You send in the computer geeks. In 2010, a highly sophisticated, incredibly malicious computer worm known as Stuxnet magically found its way into the computers of Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. This wasn't just a basic computer glitch. The virus literally caused massive, heavy uranium centrifuges to spin wildly out of control until they physically destroyed themselves. But the war wasn't just digital. On the streets of Tehran, highly trained assassins on motorcycles began covertly targeting and eliminating key Iranian nuclear scientists. Iran, meanwhile, adopted a terrifying grand strategy known as the Ring of Fire, aiming to completely encircle Israel with heavily armed militant groups. Using the Quds Force, their elite extraterritorial military unit, they massively funded and armed Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the Houthis in Yemen. They smuggled thousands of rockets, precision-guided missiles, and advanced suicide drones to these proxies, creating a constant, deadly threat right on Israel's immediate borders. To counter this, Israel launched what they called the Campaign Between Wars. This was an ongoing, highly secretive air campaign across the Middle East. Israeli stealth fighters systematically bombed hundreds of Iranian weapons convoys and military bases hidden inside neighboring Syria, trying desperately to cut off the supply lines. The Shadow War eventually spilled out into the open oceans. Both sides began quietly sabotaging each other's commercial cargo ships and oil tankers. Imagine sailing a massive oil tanker and suddenly, boom, a mysterious limpet mine blows a hole in your hull. Just another Tuesday in the Middle East. For over 30 years, this intricate, invisible war was carefully calibrated. Both sides threw heavy punches, but they always kept it just below the threshold of total war. But in early 2024, the unwritten rules of this delicate shadow war were finally shattered. The boiling pot completely spilled over. On April 1st, a surgical airstrike hit an Iranian diplomatic compound in Damascus, Syria, completely flattening the consulate building. The strike eliminated several top-ranking commanders of Iran's elite Quds Force. Israel didn't officially claim responsibility, but everyone knew who did it. For Tehran, striking a diplomatic compound was crossing an ultimate red line. It was seen as a direct attack on sovereign Iranian soil. The supreme leadership vowed severe punishment. And for the very first time in history, they decided not to use their proxy militias. On the night of April 13th, the world held its breath. Iran launched an unprecedented, massive direct military attack against Israel. Operation True Promise began with a terrifying swarm of over 170 kamikaze drones, slowly making their way across the Middle Eastern sky. But that was just the bait. Shortly after, they fired more than 120 heavily armed ballistic missiles and 30 cruise missiles. It was one of the largest combined aerial assaults in modern military history. In response, Israel activated its deeply layered air defense network. But they weren't alone. An extraordinary coalition including the United States, the UK, France, and even neighboring Arab nations scrambled fighter jets. The night sky above Jerusalem lit up with glowing interceptions. Missiles were shot down in space, creating surreal, silent bursts of light. The result was a technological miracle. An astonishing 99% of the projectiles were intercepted before they could cause any significant damage. Militarily, the attack was thwarted, but psychologically, the world had fundamentally changed. The Shadow War was now entirely out in the open. A few days later, Israel responded with a highly precise, limited strike on an air defense radar in Isfahan, deep inside Iran. It was a clear, chilling message: we can hit you anywhere. The era of proxies was over. The two heavyweights were finally standing face to face. Looking back at this incredible 70-year journey, it feels almost impossible to believe how drastically things have changed between these two nations. The exact same countries that once secretly shared oil pipelines and agricultural technology are now locked in a fierce, high-tech struggle for regional dominance. So, what is the ultimate lesson here? Why did the greatest of secret friends suddenly become the bitterest of open enemies? Back in the 1950s, their alliance was built purely on cold, hard survival. They shared a common enemy in the rising tide of Arab nationalism. But when the 1979 Islamic Revolution happened, the entire geopolitical calculus was violently rewritten overnight. Ideology suddenly replaced pragmatism. Israel was no longer seen as a strategic partner to be utilized, but an ideological anomaly to be destroyed. And for Israel, Iran completely transformed from a reliable, wealthy energy supplier into an existential, nuclear-armed threat surrounding their borders with rings of fire. It perfectly illustrates the oldest, most cynical rule of global geopolitics: nations do not have permanent friends. And they do not have permanent enemies. They only have permanent interests. Morality, friendship, and loyalty are merely illusions when it comes to the ruthless game of national survival. Today, the Middle East remains a highly volatile powder keg, and this unprecedented shadow war between Tehran and Jerusalem is far from over. And as these two heavyweights step completely out of the shadows, the rest of the world watches nervously, hoping the fragile glass doesn't break. History is absolutely full of these crazy, forgotten twists. If you want to uncover more incredible secrets from the geopolitical past, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It really helps our little penguin stay out of trouble and keep making these videos. Check out our other deep dives on modern history and global conflicts right here on the screen. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, keep questioning everything.